Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Mark Wallace, your host and facilitator of the People Show. We are welcoming you to be here again for another edition of the People Show on this Women's History Month on March 24th. We're going to be talking with a special guest coming up in just a few minutes, but we certainly want to thank all of you for participating in the program. And we've got some great things that are coming up. And of course, you know that we're in the middle of the election cycle. One of the things that I want to talk about extremism. We've been talking about a little bit about that, but I want to talk about it specifically tonight. And we are going to have one of our guests on who is going to help us with it, Dr. Peter Simi, who is a professor of sociology at Chapman University. He has studied extremist groups and violence for more than 25 years, conducting interviews and observations with a range of violent gangs and political extremists. Dr. Simi is a member of the NCITE Insight at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, which is the newest scientific study of the causes of consequences of terrorism in the United States and around the world. Semaya is the co-author of the work of the two books, manuscripts, American Swastika, Inside the White Power Movement, Hidden Spaces of Hate, and Out of Hiding, Extremist White Supremacy and How It Can Be Stopped. Frequently serves as an expert legal consultant on criminal and civil cases related to political extremism. He also, in 2021, he provided expert testimony on behalf of the plaintiffs in the landmark civil case, Signs versus Kessler, aimed at holding the organizers of the deadly 2017 Unite the Right rally accountable for the violence and helped incite and commit in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2023. He testified on behalf of the plaintiffs in Norma Anderson versus Jenna Griswold and Donald J. Trump about the relationships between far-right extremists and Trump and the role the former president played in the attack on the U.S. Capitol. Welcome to the program, Dr. Simi. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Well, thanks for having me, Mark. Appreciate it.
Yeah, now, of course, there are many people who would say that they thought that race relations has gotten better in the country, but we know that we saw it rear its ugly head when Barack Obama announced that he was running for president back in 2007 or whatever that six, and we saw that it reared its ugly head. And the question remains: is did we really make progress? And if we did, how much progress did we make? And have we been set back, or did something happen like a volcano that just allowed for what has always been there to be in place, and we just assumed that things were getting better? What's your take?
Well, I think it's a little bit of everything you just described, frankly. Certainly there have been progresses made. The civil rights movement was an extraordinary time period in terms of the effort, commitment, the courage that individuals, everyday nameless, faceless individuals made, as well as, well-known, leaders, Martin Luther King Jr. obviously being probably the most well-known, but obviously a much larger number of folks who took leadership positions and literally put their lives on the line, in some cases sacrificing their lives as he did. So that should not be, we shouldn't overlook, because it's a good example of what can happen, what can be done with the right type of organization, with the right type of ethical principles, frankly, guiding it. So that progress is important to recognize and not lose sight of. But we also can't, overestimate the extent in terms of the progress that was made. Of course, there was substantial resistance at the time of the civil rights movement, But also we saw as progress was being made, especially when you get to the 1980s, I think is a particularly important period of time where you see a real backlash starting to gain ground, as part of really what became known as the Reagan Revolution. And that was multifaceted, that backlash, but it took the face of, for instance, specific things like the idea of reverse racism. And you started finding, substantial number of cases being filed based on the idea of reverse racism, which was meant to really try and counter some of the efforts in terms of affirmative action. And of course, we've seen more recently that resistance to affirmative action, unfortunately, being quite successful. So the 80s is, I think, an important period of time to look at. I think certainly the election of Obama in 2008, again, another period where it's this really kind of moment where, in many respects, it's indicative of the kind of progress that continued to be made, really kind of spirited from the civil rights movement in many respects, but also at the same time there's great resistance, and his election spurs a lot of kind of anger and resentment that was there before, but it's maybe in a more dormant stage, and it really kind of energized that. And of course, on the night of his election, the largest white supremacist web forum at the time, which was known as Stormfront, it literally shut down from all the traffic they were getting. And of course, you also get the second wave of the anti-government militia movement that formed shortly after Obama's election in 2008. So you get groups like the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters that were really kind of an extension of the militia movement from the 90s, but after Oklahoma City had kind of gone underground. And so this is, his election. I think it's very significant in terms of this second wave of the anti-government militia movement. You get the Tea Party movement, which was known as kind of anti-tax and grassroots, but is really a reaction to Obama's election. Of course, it's not coincidental that many of the images they would display at their rallies would be of Obama, but in very kind of racist caricature form. Linking him as a African tribal chief. Of course, you get birtherism, that comes to really take a substantial form, claiming he's not a legitimate president, which, again, I think you have to look at that through a racial lens. And, not coincidentally, Donald Trump becomes one of the major faces of birtherism in terms of this kind of conspiracy theory. So that a lot's happening in the years before his election, but also after as well.
So, of course, Donald Trump becoming president seems to have gaslit the racial tensions even more so, put it on steroids, as I say. But in the context of that, and it's only gotten worse. It's only gotten worse now that he seems to thrive on that. He seems to just double down on that in all of his rhetoric, whether he believes it or not. He knows that it incites people and doesn't really care about what the consequences of that is. And of course, in different groups that I talk to, and obviously in the Black community, is that you will hear some people who say, well, look, racism, we're victims of it. We're victims of bigotry and hate and race violence and that sort of thing. Isn't this the responsibility of white conscience people to deal with this? How do you view that when you have various different groups? Then you have white groups who say, well, I'm not a racist. I'm not a bigot. I have nothing to do with that. So why is that my responsibility?
I mean, I think it's all of our responsibility. As a society, we are part of a collective, and we should see, ourselves in relation to each other, and we're interdependent. And I do think white individuals and groups who do have a conscience in terms of these issues have absolutely a substantial responsibility to try and speak and act in ways that are helping, to diminish the problem. Well, first to acknowledge the problem, because that's, I think, a big part of the issue is there's so much denial and there's so much refusal to acknowledge historically what's happened, but also what continues to happen and how history is connected to the present. We've seen just a massive wave of this kind of collective denialism sweeping the country in the last few years that I find just one of the most frightening aspects of what we've seen is this collective denialism, the effort to really rewrite history in ways that is just frankly shocking. There's always been a problem with sanitizing history and sugarcoating things and presenting things. I mean, I was taught U.S. history in the 1980s, and we were taught that, Nat Turner was a fanatic, and as opposed to a freedom fighter, that John Brown was a fanatic. We were taught certain things about the Civil War that I don't think were accurate. Certainly weren't taught the full context of what happened in terms of the level of violence during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War ended. So there's certainly things, during that time period that I don't think we got right. But compared to what's happening today, actually, we were doing far better in many respects when you see the efforts in various states across the country to literally rewrite history in ways, or to just erase history, which is just as bad. So I think we all have a responsibility and an obligation to address these issues.
So how do we fight back against where you have these Republican agendas in different states that are banning books and trying to legislate on how history can be taught, or even if it can be taught, depending upon what municipality that you're on? Where does that stem from? How do you characterize that?
Characterize it in how would I characterize those efforts, or
Yes.
how to respond?
Both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I characterize the efforts, again, I think denialism. We are there. It's almost a kind of a contagion of denialism that I think you see sweeping our society, and not just the U.S., because it is happening in other parts of the globe as well. But you have things like climate denialism, which is climate change denialism. Obviously, that's part of the puzzle. So it's really, I think, a more pervasive kind of way of thinking about the world that has gained ground. And the kind of denialism in terms of the book banning is one facet of a broader kind of way in which this way of looking at the world has kind of, like I said, gained ground. And that is really, I think, in many respects, it's a rejection of a science. It's a rejection of really taking an evidence-based approach to trying to solve problems. And it's really a movement towards authoritarianism. And so part of this is really moving away from democracy and democratic principles, which is, we're seeing a lot of voter suppression is a big part of what we're talking about here in terms of this denialism, denying people the right to vote. So this is, I think, something we have to keep in mind, that our democratic system, as imperfect as it has been historically, still does, have the potential for us to become a more perfect, union. And I think some people are becoming less and less interested in democratic principles and more comfortable with the idea of embracing some type of authoritarianism. And of course, I think that's what Trump represents. And so I think that's where the real kind of where we're at in terms of the moment of going off the cliff, in terms of really descending into an abyss of authoritarianism, where even the potential for improving things won't be there anymore. Right. So historically, we've had these issues have been part of our society since the founding of the republic. Terrible atrocities have been committed, terrible injustices, but there's always been the potential through things like social movements we talked about earlier, the civil rights movement, the role it's played. Those potentials existed. If we were to fall off the cliff and descend into some type of real substantial authoritarianism, those potentials would no longer be part of the system, and that's my grave fear at the moment in terms of what we face coming, really, frankly, in a few months in November.
Well, look, Trump has been a factor of gaslighting, and certainly inciting the, whether they're, false fears for whatever his own motivations are, for whatever agenda that he is trying to put forth, and he's latched on to that sort of thing, and he has, in a lot of ways, he's been a license for that kind of hate to openly express itself, to openly, feel like, we're emboldened, and we have a someone there at that time in the highest office in the land, who in many respects in their consciousness saying it's okay for us to be free, to be who we are, and to push back against what they characterize as these people taking over our land, or taking over our property, or taking over our country. In this whole idea of we're going to take back our country, what that ideology means. How, you say that we can stop it. How can we stop it? Because it seems to not only have reared its ugly head, but it has dug in deep. How do we reverse that cycle?
Yeah, well, you're right. It is very deep. So white supremacy is deeply entrenched in our society, in our collective psyche. So it really does require a number of things. It has to be a multifaceted approach. There's not any magic bullets, unfortunately. There's no easy way out of this. I will say we have to think, I think, in terms of immediate responses and long-term responses. So the most immediate response, in my view, and I know some don't maybe see it this way, and I fully appreciate our political system's imperfect, and sometimes it seems like both parties are, corrupted by lobbying interests and big money and all that, and to some extent that's certainly true. But there are differences that are important, and I think come November, if people don't take advantage, and again, it obviously there's one vote in particular, but all at all levels, voting is important, and if we stop taking advantage, of course, our voter turnout rates, we've had a problem with that for quite some time, in terms of a much smaller portion of people voting than should be voting. And of course, there's now concerted efforts to keep that and make that percentage of the population even lower. So that, to me, is an immediate thing that we can all do, is register to vote and make sure and turn out, and vote again across, not just in the big elections, but at all, because local things, as you were mentioning earlier, I mean, those are very important in terms of some of these efforts that are underway in terms of banning books and things like that. So we need to reinvest and reinvigorate voting, and seeing that as an important instrument of power and something that can be wielded as part of a larger effort in terms of progressive change. There's other immediate things too that I think need to be addressed when it comes to this problem, because when we talk about the problem exists on multiple levels as well. And so, we've talked about kind of some of these we might call nonviolent strategies, things more institutionalized. But there's also an element of this that's very important to recognize as well, which is the violence that is committed in the name of what we're discussing here. We've seen attacks across the country: El Paso, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, too many really to name here, where single individuals who are motivated and acting on behalf of the larger cause of white supremacy, murder innocent civilians as part of this ideology. To stem, oftentimes, specifically, the so-called Great Replacement, the idea that the white race is being intentionally replaced in the United States. And again, this is happening in other countries as well, where similar circumstances are in place. So that kind of violence, that we need to respond to that. We need to have resources in place to deal with that at multiple levels in terms of prevention and intervention. And unfortunately, when those incidents happen, we need to have the resources in place to deal with those individuals. And so that does mean, law enforcement has to be part of this, response as well. And that's important, that these individuals are, taken off the streets and dealt with, and that, individuals that commit that kind of violence need to be, face penalties, and severe penalties, obviously. So, you've got those more immediate needs, and then you've got the long-term. How do we go about creating a more just society? And in my view, that's going to require a real kind of new kind of imagination in terms of thinking about these problems, but also a new type of deal, really, to invoke the original New Deal under FDR. We're going to need a massive reinvestment that addresses things like the really grotesque economic inequality that characterizes our society. The gap between the poor and the rich in this country has just continued to worsen. And the percentage of taxes that wealthy pay, while they may pay large amounts, the percentage has been going down. And the amount of we're investing in our country's infrastructure is just it's not consistent with a healthy society. The amount that we're investing just in basic things, even like roads and bridges. So we're going to need that kind of long-term change in our thinking and how we allocate resources and how we govern our society.
Well, when we speak to this, right, we're talking about extremism and white supremacy, and everything legislatively now, everything is being gaslight based on one group saying that they're coming after us, and hate. And so we have one candidate that represents nothing but hate. And then we have our current president, who represents that of decency and trying to get us to think about solving problems. Now, we can talk about how we solve those problems and the differences that we have, and there's, which is healthy to have, healthy conversations. But it is hard to even get to a healthy debate about approach to solving problems when you have one group, no matter what you mention, whether it's helping children or helping old people, we have one group who turns it into an extremist of hate discussion. They just gaslight hate on everything. So when you talk about wealthy people paying their fair share of taxes to solve problems, it's turned into an us versus them, which turns it into a black versus white, when we're really talking about the issue. Should, in your conversations and in your travels and your discussions about this with white groups, are you finding more white groups that are willing and wanting to be more overt about saying there's a stark difference that we have to do here? We have to elect a president who at least that we could have a conversation with, and certainly do away with one who is doing nothing but gaslighting hate. Then we could talk about how we solve the problems.
I am. I am seeing more of that. Just the discussion of white supremacy. I started doing this work 1996, so shortly after the Oklahoma City bombing. So, I've seen over that course of that time, there is a change in terms of just acknowledgement and just the discussion, the resonance of the term white supremacy. Wasn't that long ago where when people you use that term, people kind of look at you funny, like they didn't know what you were talking about. Now it's become pretty commonplace to hear that term used to describe American history and society and how the social system's been organized. So I think that's a very positive. Of course, with that means that sometimes people misuse that term and use it in ways maybe even unintentionally that may not be fully all that helpful. But that's and that's important to, I think about how do we correct for that as we become more as that term becomes more kind of part of the parlance and in part of our discussion, is that we do want to be careful about using it in a way that doesn't further the divide and further polarize and further kind of increase and provide, frankly, ammunition for folks that are already committed to white supremacy and want to use every little thing to their advantage. You don't want to give them ammunition, obviously. So I think the fact, though, that it has become more familiar and common, that's a positive sign. And I guess I would say I'm sorry, I totally lost the second part of your question there.
Well, the second part was the question of should we, have the conversation, and I was saying that you talk to white groups, and should we say, we got an election that's coming up, and the focus at this point, because there is so much dissension and hate that's out there, that we should not be so focused on policy, because we can discuss policy if we, if we can at least have a reasonable discussion between reasonable people. So shouldn't we just focus on making sure that the person who represents hate, that we make this this argument that let's focus on that, even if I don't like some of the policies that come out of this current administration, but we could at least have a conversation on how we negotiate those policies, rather than someone who just wants to perpetuate hate. Let's just make sure that we do not allow for that to come back in. So that's all we're going to have to contend with.
I could not agree with you more. And one of the things that does scare me, though, I've talked to a lot of young people, given my job. I do, and I don't have any idea of how pervasive this is. I hope it's not, but I have heard some young people suggest that the only way to true transformative kind of politics for us to really become a more just society is for us to hit rock bottom. And that maybe means bringing Trump back into office to help us hit rock bottom. And that scares the daylights out of me, that thinking. And I fear that might be, again, characteristic of some element of especially young people who do feel disenfranchised, that feel like the political system is just corrupt to the core, and really do, have good intentions. They want to see us improve society in fundamental ways, not just little reforms, but actually transformative ways. And that's great. I agree with all that. But the idea of using Trump to hit rock bottom is a very dangerous proposition. So I hope there aren't many folks who are thinking about that in those terms come November.
Well, when Trump was running, no one could have ever convinced me that he would have become the president of the United States. And I was on the one side that was saying that this is not going to happen. This is not going to happen, that Donald Trump would become the president of the United States, no matter how much people were not in love with Hillary Clinton. Even then, for me, it was it was a choice between decency and indecency. That was the choice. Not that Hillary Clinton was such a great candidate for the presidency, but that wasn't the main issue. The main issue was, decency or indecency, and then we can talk about the issues and debate on how we solve problems. But Donald Trump got into office. Later on, I was at that point and said, maybe God let this happen so that the rest of us can really see that we really need to deal with the greater problems of inequities and those types of, and helping the poor and dealing with those kinds of situations. Maybe we had to have a Trump to kind of jar us to saying that this is not where we want to be. This is not where we want to be. And it's really important that we get to solving problems so that we don't have that. I thought that we had hit rock bottom with Trump in office. So to hear you say that there are some people, young people, who are saying we need to have a Trump to hit rock bottom, and maybe because they were too young to even pay attention at the time, that they think that, they didn't even pay attention that we hit rock bottom from 2016 to 2020. But to bring him back would be even lower than rock bottom. We would go to the depths, and in my view, and based on what we're hearing from them, and based on what they have openly said that their plans are to do, is to blow up any progress that we have made as a country, certainly as it relates to race relations. And we know that there are systemic policies that are embedded in our politics and in our policies that we have to deal with. But to go back to Donald Trump, to see that somehow that's going to be a corrective path to us is frightening.
Yeah, I agree. I think we have to be careful with comparisons to Hitler, but at the same time, in this case, I think it's appropriate, and I've never made that comparison. It's not a partisan issue. I know sometimes people confuse partisanship here with this. I've never compared Ronald Reagan, George, either of the Bushes, John McCain, when he was running in 2008. I've never compared any recent Republican candidate in that kind of sense, or seen them as the kind of existential threat that I think Donald Trump represents. So for me, it's not a partisan issue. I think it sounds like for you as well, it's an issue about values. It's an issue about ethics. It's about really democracy. And Trump has made it very clear he doesn't believe in democracy. He doesn't believe in the basic principles, the core ethics, the ethos of democracy. He has a real kind of love affair with authoritarianism, and he sees himself in that vein. And what's frightening is that's not just completely rejected by the entire American public. Unfortunately, there is a segment of the public who have come to identify with him and see him in this almost like a cult-like, figure, the kind of hold he seems to have on that core base of the so-called MAGA. That he really, no matter what he says or does, they are unwavering in their support and following of him, and that's a very dangerous situation. It's of course antithetical to democracy to have that kind of influence over the public. So yeah, we just need to reject that. It seems to me.
Well, I certainly think that we need to, but again, there are people, in the Black community, and my show and my audience is largely the Black community. We talk about issues that impact the Black community, and I think that, but there are people, through their frustrations, right, through their frustrations with the inequality that has just been pervasive in the Black community for decades. And that they feel like um, the Democratic Party, which is the party that we, mostly align to, um, just has not dealt with those issues in a way that many believe that should be have dealt with. We should be much further ahead than we are. So Trump, being the antithesis to that, right, and saying I'm your retribution, he doesn't care about solving those problems. So he plays on that, and it is somewhat concerning that people about it. Listen, my co-host, who is a Black journalist, retired journalist, who says that if it came down to Donald Trump and came down to Joe Biden, that he could not vote for Joe Biden. And if you look at the track record between the two, they're worlds apart. So it's that kind of sentiment, even with people who are relatively intelligent people, but because of um, this anger that is in place that says this one party hasn't done enough, and they haven't done enough. That this should be, in my view, an opportunity for the party to say, then we have got to solve bigger problems. We got to solve bigger problems, and we have to hear those people, and then we have to address those ills. But we cannot get there. We can't get there if there is a large segment of society to say, let's bring this guy back to blow it all up. And because, as you say, he doesn't care about democracy. He certainly doesn't even care about solving problems. What he cares about is doing whatever he wants to do, is just having power and control. Forget about the criminal cases that are facing him, but this is about having power and control to rule over people. And like you said, none of us have, at least and I have not made comparisons to George W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, Ronald Reagan, uh, Richard Nixon. I've never made those kind of comparisons to a dictator like Hitler, somebody as dangerous as Hitler. But when you think of Donald Trump, you think about those comparisons to, and there are other people who have made that this is what uh, could potentially be become if this guy got back to the presidency, because he's been there before and he now knows what to do to make sure that he embeds the kind of people that he needs to have in place so that he can do what it is that he's saying that he wants to do and completely blow it up.
Yeah, one of the things this makes me think of is that you sometimes hear the question, is Donald Trump symptom or cause? And, my response is always it's both, right? And so I do think that's an important piece of what you were just talking about, is that the symptom part, we can't lose sight of that. As much as he is a cause and represents something that is very dangerous, but he's also a symptom of these underlying problems that have to be at the forefront of how we address the threat that Trump represents, and not make it singularly about Trump, but also broaden it to what he, kind of is symptomatic of. And, one of the things he says that I think, he does a lot of things that are quite strategic, and I think we need to acknowledge that part as well. And what, he has that statement he's said multiple times, is specifically targeting potentially Black voters, is something to the effect of what else do you have to lose, or something like that. But it's really this idea of playing to what you were just describing, that sense of really kind of frustration with the lack of progress and what the Democrats haven't really delivered in many respects. And so I think we have to acknowledge that, we have to look at that. We have to look at it, more broadly as to why people have been attracted, or why some segment of the population have been attracted to Trumpism, and not just write it off as, craziness, or, whatever term you want to use that may or may not be accurate. But it doesn't help necessarily to use those kind of just ways that dismiss the problem in that, kind of easy way. We really do have to, I think, tackle this and struggle with why he was able to get elected the first time, and why he, has a decent chance of being elected again in 2024.
Well, one of the problems that allows for this hate and these extremist groups to to continue to flourish is that there is a segment of the population and a segment of the Black community that the Democrats, right now, if anybody had told me that Joe Biden's administration would have been able to do some of the great things that they've been able to get done, right? We have to play the long game. We have to play the long game. But unfortunately, there are some groups that you don't have, they don't have that kind of patience. They don't have that, that kind of view. And in many respects, they don't have that kind of view because nobody's talking to them. Nobody sees them. And they don't watch mainstream media. They don't watch mainstream news. And they're not getting the information to the guys who are in the parks, or the guys who are in the barbershops, the guys who are gathering in places where they may get their information from some other type of social media, that the Democrats are out of touch. And that's what a great deal of the population says. So you have the extremist group who plays on that, right? They play on that and they try to convince them, okay, come into our cult because, we're the answer for you, when in fact we know that they're not the answer for them. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with that going forward to making sure, one, that the Democrats are not using these old white guys talking to, trying to communicate to a group of people that they don't even see or they don't even understand? How do we make that connection?
Well, yeah, there needs to be some major, I think, changes in terms of the Democratic Party as an institution. I think there's been some efforts to do this, but it needs to be not enough. It hasn't been enough to be more representative of the diversity that exists within the American population. Part of it's also technology. I mean, one of the things we saw in 2016 that characterized the Trump campaign was how adept he was at using social media, even as kind of somewhat not a initially it was he didn't look like he was going to be the nominee even, but they did a good job. His campaign did a good job of utilizing various platforms, including Facebook, a much better job than, frankly, the Clinton campaign did. And so using technologies, I think, that's the world we live in now. Now, there's a lot of problem with this technology too. And of course, this is how a lot of the disinformation and misinformation is circulating. The conspiracy theories that, have existed since, throughout the human history, there's been conspiracy theories, but certainly the way in which they're circulating now is more, with greater speed and reaching greater numbers of people than ever before because of the technology. And so we also need to use the technology to reach people, but we also are going to need to regulate the technology and start figuring out, because right now I would consider it to be essentially the Wild West when it comes to digital environments, and it's frankly lawless. There's just absolute lawlessness occurring, including the promotion of some of that very violence I spoke about earlier, where you can, easily access videos that are promoting, celebrating single individuals who have gone out and committed attacks like the Buffalo attack at the grocery store and elsewhere, where it celebrates that and it encourages people to engage in further violence. So there's just a whole buffet of toxic environment, toxic material that's easily available in these digital environments. And so we're going to have to, I think, really figure out how to handle that, how to use it for organizational purposes. The Democrats, I think, should be working on that. But as a society, we're also going to need to figure out how to better manage these environments and that type of technology.
Well, and you're right. But when we start talking about, again, when we start talking about substantive ideas and solving problems, the other side looks for ways to use hate to reject that. See, everything is about taking control of what you're doing. That's why you need to reject them. And we have the better answer, but they don't have a policy to differ or to debate with what the one side is saying. And this is what's concerning is that they're not interested in solving problems. They are just interested in using hate to further the insecurities of some people who may not even really be people who believe in that in hate, but they become radicalized. They become radicalized and become a part of that group, and they start spewing the same thing because I can certainly see where you have people who have been motivated to go do things like going into a church and shooting up, killing 9 black people into a Bible study, right? All of this is fueled by this rhetoric that comes from this one individual that brings up, the lower nature of people, right? And we all have it, but it brings up the lower nature in people and whatever their frustrations are and whatever their anxieties are, that they just come to a boiling point where they go and say, hey, this person has given me license to go do this. I can go shoot somebody and not have to pay any consequences. When you have a man who says I can stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and they would still vote for me, meaning that I wouldn't have any consequences for it. And people go act onto that.
Yeah.
How do we deal with that?
Well, yeah. I mean, again, I think it's got to be multifaceted. I mean, when you have that kind of violence, there has to be. I know we have to be concerned about mass incarceration and furthering the security state as some folks refer to it. Fine, and I get that those are all legitimate issues to be concerned about, but when you're dealing with like the kind of violence that we're describing, we're talking about, that to me does need to be dealt with. There needs to be a law enforcement response to that. There needs to be incarceration for those individuals. There's a public safety aspect here that needs to be dealt with. Again, but we also can't only rely on that. You can't, as the saying goes, arrest your way out of the problem. So there's more work to be done on terms of prevention and intervention. How do you deal with individuals who are getting radicalized, that we don't allocate nearly enough resources to help families, for example, deal with a loved one who they see, that's going down a rabbit hole and want to try and help, but don't know how. It's a very difficult situation. I've talked to a lot of families who've been in that situation, and it's a very difficult one for them. So, there's things we could do in terms of allocating resources to help families that we're really not. And then, of course, there's, prevention. Again, a lot of this today now is circulating through these digital environments I was mentioning a few minutes ago, and that we're really not doing much in terms of trying to, regulate that. And again, it comes back to what you said, is that if you propose that, there are a lot of folks who just don't want to solve problems. And we have this issue of, it seems that there's a segment of our, political leaders who just don't believe in government, frankly. They seem to are trying to promote an agenda that would essentially make government non-functioning and less able to really exist in any kind of concrete way. Reagan long ago said that government's not the solution; it's the problem, or something to that effect, as I recall.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that was, I mean, he obviously was utilized. He was working with Congress, and there was bipartisanship to some extent, much more so than there is today. But what you're seeing among some of these folks, the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world, they seem to just really not want there to be any kind of functioning government, and that's hard to address, obviously.
Right, right. So in your writings and in your research, talking to white groups, talking to white audiences, what's their answers? What are their answers to dealing with pushing back and stopping the extremist of white supremacy? What do they believe that they can do?
I think it ranges. I think you see some folks that are working on more education, trying to address the problem from that vantage point, which I think is, there is an aspect of it, although it's not exclusively, because I don't think you can solve this problem solely through the idea of that, people lack education, so therefore they fall prey to these kinds of groups. Education has a role to play. I think education we could be much more proactive, especially at earlier ages, in children's lives, about teaching things like emotional intelligence, teaching things about the importance of cooperation, and the importance of diversity, and helping people understand, young people understand the role that plays as a strength, not a source of threat, which is a lot of what these kind of white supremacist extremists are feeding off of, the idea of that diversity is a source of threat. In fact, it's an existential threat. It's a zero-sum game, and we're going to lose. As the demographics continue to change in this country, as culture continues to change, we're on the losing end of this, and it can't be. We can't have a shared system. It's there's winners and losers, and so I think there are things that we could do more proactively in terms of helping children adopt worldviews that would be somewhat kind of provide some inoculation in terms of when they are exposed to these ideas in other parts of their lives, they might be more resilient to being able to fend that off. Again, that means getting into schools and implementing that kind of curriculum. Easier said than done, especially given what we've been talking about here today. I think other folks look at it in terms of economics and want to see more economic justice, and think that if we're able to reduce the amount of inequality, that would help kind of quell some of this polarization and some of the kind of conflict that you see that characterizes American society today. I think some see it more political, and we're very excited about Obama's election, and saw that as a real important point of progress, a turning point of sorts. Unfortunately, obviously that didn't really pan out the way that it might have in a different universe, I suppose you might say. So I do think it's multifaceted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, when you start talking about children, I think that some adults can learn from children, because children come into the world, they come into the world pure. They don't come into the world with a bunch of bigotry. They don't come into the world with a bunch of biases. If you put black children and white children and different ethnic children that are very young into the same room or the same playground, without being poisoned by whatever the differences that have been put into their head by their parents, that have been socialized and have different experiences, the children function a lot better, a lot more democratically than those of us who have come up and have experienced some of that hate and experience that bigotry and experience that racism, and then those that have participated in it, right? So, and children are being fed all of that into their psyches that, they now start to look at the world or look at people differently. Now, I do believe that that there's been a few generations that look at race very differently than their parents, whether they're black, white, Hispanic. They look at it very different. Like if you ask black and white children and or young adults or even Hispanic, whatever, uh, if they have white friends, black friends, or whatever, they don't identify their friends as a ethnicity or as a color. They say, no, that's my friend. That's not my black friend. That's my friend. Or that's not my white friend. That's my friend. Whereas our generations and generations before us, because of the racial differences and certainly the identity of politics, our socialization was very, very different. So in many respects, I look at children that can teach, older generations on how we need to look at each other, and certainly how we need to look at dealing with issues of the world. Um, Although there are people who live in certain areas that don't have any contact with other people outside of their community. I mean, I know there are some people who live in rural areas of white communities that never, uh, and that's hard for people to believe. They never come in contact with anybody other than the people that they come from. Um, and they identify with the entire existence of the world with what their socialization is. Do you find that in your research, or do you find that in your conversations with groups?
Yeah, one of the things you just mentioned that I think is important just to highlight is that generational change that you're describing in terms of how young people today see race in kind of different ways. And we talked at the very outset of our conversation was the idea about, well, what kinds of progress have we made, if any? And I would point to that as being a very important kind of example of progress that has been made through kind of generational change. And I think you're right, absolutely, that children always have, I think, a lot to teach adults. Unfortunately, adults don't often take advantage of it. But nobody is born, comes into the world as a hater in terms of the kind of white supremacist extremism that we've been talking about. That's something you learn over time. That's something you're exposed to, the kind of logic and ideas and emotions that underpin that kind of extremism. It's something that nobody just comes into the world with. And of course, today though, because of digital, to say it sound like a broken record, but the digital technology really does present a lot of opportunities for children to be exposed to that at pretty early ages, and that's obviously something that's very troubling and needs to be, I think, addressed. Frankly, now there's opportunities for them to be exposed to things that are antithetical to hate and extremism as well, and so that's that would be, there's always kind of two sides to these kind of technological changes that occur in our world. Usually it's usually not one or the other. And so I think that's an important piece of it though, but is really understanding the way that children can be exposed at earlier ages today more than ever, given how much and how pervasive these technologies are becoming. You're seeing children at very young ages using, the tablets and phones and so forth, and kids getting on various platforms at younger and younger ages. And again, the amount of toxic material that's just readily available on these platforms, and I'm just talking about the mainstream platforms, let alone you have other platforms that are more fringe that are even worse. But even mainstream platforms like TikTok and Twitter, or I guess now X, the things that you can view on those platforms is pretty astounding.
Well, we're certainly going to need to have more of these conversations. I certainly appreciate you giving us this time. I think that I'd like to for you to come back, and I certainly would like to do some more roundtable discussions with other people. I think that we don't have enough of these conversations, and I think that we need to have these conversations with Black and white people, and we need to identify with that. I know that some people like to look at the world and say that we should be colorblind, and I reject that premise, because if God wanted us to be colorblind, He would have made us that way. I think that we need to be decent human beings and be able to appreciate the wonder in all of us, that He has created, and that we need to smash whatever the weaknesses that we have, and not allow for people like Donald Trump and people who think like that to pour gas on the rest of us. Um, uh, we've we've got to be better than that, but we can't be better than that until we acknowledge that we have these weaknesses and where they are. Where white supremacy exists, white people need to be able to have these conversations without feeling like they're being attacked, but
Yes.
to have the conversation and saying this exists. What do we do about it, and how can we um, make progress eradicating this out of our existence? Racism's, the systemic racism is there. It's going to take some time to do that, but we have to identify, right? We have to identify that these differences exist, these problems exist first. It is not to put one person in a box and say, you're a bunch of bad people over here, right? And to have them feeling that way, as some people are using politics that are trying to couch that kind of rhetoric and that kind of conversation. But we've got to be able to have that conversation. Black folks and white folks being able to have those real conversations and say, okay, this exists. How can we commit to eradicating it from our society, and not allow people like Donald Trump to gaslight and poison us and make us even more divided?
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on, Mark, and I would absolutely love to continue the discussions and get into some, additional issues that we just weren't able to today, in terms of some of the responses, and some ways in which we are either intentionally and I think unintentionally, probably most often, having the discussion in ways that maybe are putting people in boxes and making them feel more defensive. And of course, that's not going to lead to the kind of discussions that you just described. So we've got to figure out other ways of talking about these issues.
All right. Well, listen, Peter Simi, I want to thank you for doing it, but think about that, and let's come back, and I mean come back soon, and let's discuss offline how we can formulate a conversation to deal with some of those specific issues so that we can make some progress.
Love to do that.
All right. Thank you very much for being here with us. All right, we appreciate it, folks. That's Peter Simi, who's a professor of sociology at Chapman University. It's been a great conversation, and I look forward to talking with you real soon. Hang on just 1 second for me. All right, folks. Listen, that's going to do it for this week. We have a shortened version of the People Show, and again, we'll be right back with you next week. For a longer version, I'm going to be out, so we're pre-recording this so that you get this conversation. But we're going to do this more extensively with Dr. Simi and others to have this conversation, because I think that it is vitally important for us all, for the better health of all of us, and for the country at large. Thank you all for tuning in for this edition of the People Show. We'll see you next time.